I just got lucky in the sense that not only get a tenure track job, but I got tenure because I pissed off senators.
Why do you think people believe that money cannot matter in fertility?
In the US, each person on average has roughly $100,000 in debt, national debt, but roughly $300,000 to $700,000 of unfunded liabilities. And that means each new child is worth that much in present value because they're expected to pay those things. And so that means if you give parents a cut of that, say $300,000 per parent on average, well, that's going to be a huge incentive to have kids, and that's win-win.
But the upside of doing it this way is that the introducing money into that mechanism ensures that you, at some level, find the most efficient cultural path to this problem.
One of the things you had written in the past was one of the benefits of tax breaks, whatever, some kind of economic incentive, and it can be self-funding and it can be net positive and all these other things. One of the benefits of that is that people who have large families will be relatively wealthier than they are right now. And then that means that they'll be seen as higher status. And so
Right.
that is a way of using capitalism to shift cultural norms and values towards more adaptive norms and values.
Right.
Why do you think people believe that money cannot matter in fertility?
So we have this intuition of spheres of life, and we believe the different spheres are separate from each other and don't influence each other much. So we think of family as a sphere, which is different than work as a sphere. Mm-hmm. And we think of, church as a sphere, or, politics as a sphere. And so often what we do is we try to locate a problem in a sphere, and then we say, well, the fix has to be in the same sphere. And so when we look at fertility, I think it is true that the proximate causes of fertility are cultural changes. And then so people say, well, obviously the fix has to be cultural changes. And in some sense, yes, cultural changes are a plausible candidate that would fix the fertility problems, because that's the proximate causes, but it doesn't mean that's the only thing.
And it doesn't mean it's the most tractable way to solve it.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and I think the reason I find it so interesting is I see people who believe that incentives matter and are fungible across realms, or I think whatever you called it, zones,
spheres.
Or whatever. Spheres. Even people who typically think that these things are fungible across spheres will point to policies where they gave $20,000 per child and it didn't completely fix fertility
Right.
decline, and say, oh, therefore there's no help to and I'm like, there's no other area of life, like you're pro organ donation, you're pro everything else, and here for some reason money is no object on people's choices, when like clearly the opportunity cost of having kids is a big part of why people are having less kids. And if we can reduce that opportunity cost,
we have this long history of people trying to enforce the sphere thing, where capitalism getting involved in other spheres was seen as a terrible thing, and they were trying to prevent that. Mm-hmm. And so, say prostitution, for example, right? There's the sex sphere of life, and then there's money, and then people don't want that influence. And I think that's also an addition here, that mostly when people have thought that capitalism influenced culture, they have conspiracy stories about how terrible that was. And they just don't know about all the other ways in which capitalism changed culture for the better. But I think there is this issue, basic issues. So to quickly summarize, in the US, each person on average has roughly $100,000 in debt, national debt, but roughly $300,000 to $700,000 of unfunded liabilities. And that means each new child is worth that much in present value because they're expected to pay those things. And so that means if you give parents a cut of that, say $300,000 per parent on average, well, that's going to be a huge incentive to have kids, and that's win-win. And that's that we can afford that. If the kid's going to pay $700,000, we can give $300,000 to the parent in order to make a win-win deal here. And then I'd want to do it in terms of shares of future tax payments, so that higher quality kids are paid more to parents, and we don't have the problem of like the lots of low quality kids grabbing the same amount of money. But I do think if we on average gave $300,000 worth to each kid on via giving them transferable shares of the kids' future tax payments, I think the thing we can know is that to realize that $300,000, parents will be searching in a space of alternative ways to live. in order to make that happen. They would think about, can I go to school less? Can I live in a more communal place? Can I be more rural? Can I be less ambitious on my job? Like, they will be searching in the space of possibilities there. Can I get married early, right? And I think we can be pretty sure that whatever they find will in fact reverse some of the key cultural trends that have in fact been causing falling fertility. And people love those trends. And so they would be honestly, correctly in fear of those key trends being reversed. Let's list them. We've got gender equality, more years of schooling, delayed marriage for capstone versus cornerstone marriage, less parental control over children's lives, higher standards for how much attention parents should be giving to children. All of these trends are causing lower fertility, but each trend people kind of cherish and like. They approve of these trends. And what you would in fact see is the groups of people who are managing to get all this money are in fact the groups that are figuring out ways to reverse these trends. And some people would be pissed because they would see these communities, they might be especially religious communities, especially rural, especially Republican, who knows what, but they are not going to be the ideal bohemian urban, youth culture. It's going to be a different world, and then that will be a challenge. That is, I'm trying to remember the name for urban bohemian hipsters. The hipster world will see their world as declining in status, declining in social significance, at the expense of these other people who are getting a lot of money they're not, and be pissed.
But the upside of doing it this way is that the introducing money into that mechanism ensures that you, at some level, find the most efficient cultural path to this problem, solution to this problem.
If you're willing to accept that we need to make changes for fertility, which many people have not accepted.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, one positive of doing it based on taxes in one way or the other, whether it's the parents' taxes or the kids' future taxes, is that it at least partly fixes the degree to which this only rewards the religious non-mixing communities, right? Like it at least tells productive people, it gives a way for productive people to cash in on it as well.
And even encourages them more. They get paid more.
Right. One question I have that's a technical thing, which is the value per kid. Isn't it only worth giving tax breaks to that are equal to the number of marginal babies that the tax break policy creates? As in, if we're giving $300K per baby, wouldn't that not be self-funding, because a lot of those babies would have been born whether we had the program or not? And we want to only we want to make it so that it's like per marginal baby.
You want the counterfactual baby, right? Is it?
Yeah. Right. Yes. The baby that wouldn't have been born without the policy. I shouldn't it be priced in terms of that, in terms of how many babies it creates?
Okay, but now walk through this. So we could construct statistical models of who would be likely to have a baby anyway, and then, at least statistically be paying more for the people who aren't likely to have a baby. But now you'll create incentives earlier in the game for people to acquire the characteristics that make them seem unlikely to have a baby so that they could then get the extra benefit of the counterfactual payment. So you might say, well, look, rural people who are likely to have a lot of babies, they're not getting much money because we're assuming they're going to have them. But the urban hipsters, they're going to get a lot of money. And now the rural people say, well, I'm going to go pretend to be an urban hipster for a while. And so I look like I'm not. So basically, you're giving people an incentive to make a credible threat not to have a baby, that they can get the payment.
I think I have a hard to fake proxy, though, which is just pay at the third baby and above, because most people have one. Almost everybody has one baby. Most people have two babies. A minority have three babies. So like, if you could get 50% of people who would have had two babies to have three babies, if you pay enough that you incentivize the median two baby person to have an extra baby, you're going to be paying for a way higher proportion of marginal babies than if you pay for every single baby.
But I might want to say, okay, now you should go $500,000 for the third and fourth baby, because that's partly like paying for the first two. Like they're going to have the first two planning to have a third and get that extra payment. And now you want to just raise the payment on the third and fourth.
Yes.
I mean, if you're going to limit it to the third and fourth, I want to increase the payments there. Maybe $1 million per baby, for the third and fourth or something, basically, because I'm worried about just there being a large total amount here, right? We need a big effect. because
Yeah, I
it
think
really
it
is
has,
expensive to have kids, and we're not going to move people to have a lot more kids unless we pay a lot.
the reason I think it should be for the third baby is because you have to pay for less babies, and therefore you can make chunkier payments, which are like, because there's sort of bar
So my
effects or
variation would be you get a fraction of your kid's tax revenue once you've had 3 kids or more.
yes,
We can
sure.
give it for all the kids, right? So there'd be a lump at 3, and so 3 sort of turns on the flow from all the kids,
And then that also de-risks you because you're spread across the kids, and at least one of them
right?
would make high taxes or should
Well,
pay
I
a
mean,
lot of
you'll just
taxes.
sell it off to invest speculators, so you won't actually be facing that risk, but the speculators would.
Do you think just giving the parents tax breaks is a good enough proxy for uh, having an incentive in their kids' future tax payments?
It's not clear that it is. So, I mean, I guess I'm just more comfortable if I think through and I say this just directly gets to the problem. You say, well, what about this other indirect thing? I'm like, oh, well, I have to do a lot of calculations for the indirect thing to figure out how many ways that could go wrong or how
Right.
strong it is. So maybe, but
And I'm sure there would be firms that popped up to price these things and pay parents right away as soon as
right.
that was created anyway. So it's not, because I was just thinking, oh, it's hard for a parent to understand the value of that. And I guess there would be, people would be getting put into algorithms and figuring out how likely their kids are to make certain amounts of money, and it'd be some
right.
kind of.
But I'm more okay. Basically, I say, look, the parents who would have created kids anyway would have been doing a nice gift for the rest of us.
Yeah.
I'm not so eager to tax gifts. So in general, we could just have this general attitude. Anybody ever does something nice, we can say, well, clearly we don't need to incentivize you because you're just already doing nice things. And that seems like, no, we want to pay people for doing nice things, even if they would have done it anyway.
But Robin, that's a moral value. That's not necessarily the adaptive value here.
But it sets up a nice, simple mechanism, right? So part of the problem here is that once people think, oh, we need to do something about fertility, instead of like going to the core and coming up with a simple mechanism that solves the problem in general, they just want to throw lots of little things onto the pile. Well, let's do some more housing policy. Let's do some more of this and more of that. And they just want to, that's the usual politics thing, is you have an excuse and then all the usual lobbyists and grifters pile on with the things they want. And then you don't actually end up very effective because you have a bunch of things that have the excuse of doing this and they have some effect on it, but it's not very effective. So I would rather just go straight to the core of the problem and pay for that rather than approve lots of indirect things.
The last point I wanted to make on this is that there are threshold effects here too, which is another reason that you want to pay a lot. Like if somebody gives me 20K more, I'm not going to have a third kid rather than a second kid. If they give me 500K more, I probably am going to have a third kid rather than only 2 kids.
Right.
And if 90% of people need at least 150K to have an extra kid, and most of them need more than that, the 20K vouchers are, yes, they're paying people for the gift that they were giving to society, and that's like morally a good, but they're not going to incentivize a significant amount of change relative to the dollar spent.
But I mean, plausibly, there's not only a threshold effect in individual's life, but in a community. That is, if a whole town or a city all gets these incentives, then they will be affecting each other. They will be rearranging how things are done in the city and daycare and everything, and then the status markers and the culture changes to accommodate. And I think even if we did a small experiment with just random tiny group of people, that would be a lower bound on the effect, I think, because you're not seeing all those other cultural effects.
Are you seeing people working on the policy aspect of this? That, like, I ask people this often because I kind of see a lot of people writing about fertility now, so it's like clearly in the discourse, but yeah, I haven't seen much in terms of substantive, policy work being done, but maybe I'm just sort of not plugged
as you
in.
know, the 2 main U.S. presidential candidates each have a thing in their package of proposals for some like $5,000 per baby sort of thing. And obviously that's not a commitment. And later on, what they'd probably more end up doing is subsidizing a bunch of, other people for other things on that justification, because that's what we've seen in the last decade with respect to COVID or, Build Back Better, et cetera. There's this abstract rationale of infrastructure, and then you just throw out money to all these people who want money, and you call it all infrastructure when it mostly isn't. And that's the risk here, is that you'll just give a justification for them to put this fertility label on other stuff they want to do. Yep. I think the biggest problem here is that, in fact, this doesn't have enough momentum to go very far at the moment. Yeah. And the biggest obstacle is that people do think of this as how much are we willing to pay for this? They're not thinking about this. This is a win-win deal where if we do this, we all gain and nobody loses.
Right.
Financially. And so they're not, if you could get people to think in those terms, I think it would have much better chances, but that's a hard ask. That's a hard way to rethink these.
I do think that just getting over the climate doomer narrative around kids is a big first step to getting there. And I think we're starting to get over that idea that, kids are selfish. And yeah, that's like, most people aren't even seeing kids as neutral. Many people are seeing them as a selfish choice by parents that everybody else has to subsidize.
So, but here are some negative signs we've seen lately. Like 10 years ago, this was not very politicized. It wasn't very left or right. And it's become more left or right in the last few years. And that's creating more energy for it, but also more hostility. Mm-hmm. And so because it's become more coded right, you've definitely seen a lot of people working out their counter rationales. And I've seen a lot of op-eds and essays where people explicitly say, fertility isn't a problem, the environment's a problem, and this is good, and you should stop trying to interfere with people's free choice of kids, and it's good that people don't feel pressured into having more kids than they want, and they're actually calling it racism and white supremacy. Many people are saying all this concern about fertility is just a concern that there aren't enough white kids, and therefore you're white supremacists expressing through this policy. This is just white supremacy, all about the Great Replacement, right? So that we're seeing those framings now, and that's a serious problem, because if that framing sticks, it'll be hard for large changes here to happen. The $300,000 per kid is not going to happen unless there's a pretty widespread support for a big change like that. Otherwise, and that's the level I'm thinking of we would need. 10,000 is just not going to do it. So.
You're saying like the point of leverage here is just like make this a more bipartisan popular issue rather than it's not at the level of like specific policy solutions that we can push the button on now, but just kind of build support for it broadly.
Right. So I'm fundamentally thinking in terms of there's just this threshold of enough. And I want to know what could we do that would be enough? And if you show me things that could do a little bit more, I'm going to go, yeah, but what's the chance we'll do a whole bunch of other things that will add up to enough? And that's my whole stance toward fertility and cultural drift. Somebody says, like, France is better. We should be like France because it has higher fertility than the rest of Western Europe. And I say, it's not enough. They say, yeah, but it's higher. Okay, but is there a prospect that France is going to get much higher to be enough? And if you don't see a prospect of that, I'm not going to be that excited by whatever little things you're doing.
Are you optimistic about the fact that like richer people in most societies, like the top end of the income distribution does seem to have more kids, often above replacement level or close to? So
that's been disputed a lot in terms of statistics, basically, depending on how you can do statistics a different way and see different effects. So it's a pretty weak effect. If it's there, it's mild and only at the very top. So I can't be very encouraged by that. Now, some people actually say that there's just a heritability correlation between DNA and fertility. That didn't used to be true. It seems to be more true now. And they say if that continues, then we'll just get this DNA effect where people with the high inclination to have kids just dominate the DNA, and then fertility problem gets solved. I'm skeptical, but I still think that there's a deeper problem of cultural drift that doesn't solve. But again, I do think fertility is the biggest problem. I'm happy to try to solve it. And so if that happens, that would be good.
The interesting part about what you were saying with respect to like democratic support for this kind of policy is like we'd already have to have extreme cultural change to valuing parents and children a lot to get the support for something that would pay like $300K for the marginal kid or whatever.
If we thought we were paying that, I mean, if we get people to realize you're not paying that,
right?
That's what the kid's going to pay if he's created. And so you're just giving your parents a share of what the kids make. Then they're not actually paying it now. You're not losing anything now. It's a pitch, but unfortunately, I think that's just going to be a hard sell. People see the number and they think they'll paying it, and they'll say no, love it.
So we should wrap up soon, but I wanted, if you don't mind, to switch tracks for 1 second,
Sure.
Just ask a little bit more about your career and stuff. Because one of the things that I find really interesting about you that I heard you and Agnes talk about maybe last year on a Transformative Decisions podcast was that you sort of went back to school late. So,
did.
I just was wondering if you had just general kind of career advice and thoughts, and how you thought about taking those kind of risks at that time. Because I know you mentioned you had 2 young kids and all of that. So I
Right.
just found that interesting.
So I'm weird in many ways, and that just makes it hard to give advice on the basis of my experience, because I have to wonder how like me somebody else is. Um, but um, I was not very career oriented early, and so I just kept thinking about fields because they were interesting and not planning a career. And then at some point I realized, oh, if I want a career, I'm going to have to like do some structured career planning. And so then I decided to go back to school to get a PhD. And it took me a while to figure out what subject. And I picked economics because you can just do a lot of things and call it economics. And there were a lot of things I was interested in there. And so then I finally went back to school at the age of 34 with 2 kids, age 0 and 2, when I started grad school. I picked a program that had a 4 years and you're out program, which is good compared to, say, 10-year programs. That makes a big difference there. That was Caltech. And I got lucky, I'll have to say. So, my wife wasn't that thrilled with this plan because we had, jobs and a house and kids just showing up there, right? We had 2 kids. And so I was pushing us to take a big risk with our family finances and future by going to grad school. Luckily that bet turned out, but I get the ex-ante argument that I was pushing us to take an unreasonable risk. And then I still took too much risk with respect to my research strategy, trying to get tenure, because I sort of squeaked by, and a more responsible person would have just focused more on the stuff to get tenure. And I allowed myself to do a whole bunch of other things that were interesting and important, but not on the path to tenure. And then I just got lucky in the sense that not only get a tenure track job, but I got tenure because I pissed off senators. So I had this project in 2003 called Future Map that was funded by, it's called, forgetting the names here. But anyway, there was this big blow up when some senators had a press conference accusing DARPA, that was funding us, of funding terrorism, betting markets on terrorism, because we were setting up betting markets on various things, including Middle East events. And then there was this several months of intense media coverage of this. So basically a day later, the Secretary of Defense canceled it because it was only $1 million project. Why would they take any chance for something like that? But there was all this discussion, and lots of people denouncing it, many supporting it. But then my colleagues, bless their heart, liked the fact that I pissed off senators. For free markets, they're relatively libertarian here, and which is kind of an understatement. And so the fact that I was denounced by senators for advocating free markets made them willing to give me tenure.
Bad press was good press in this situation.
In this case, right? Or being on the right side of a conflict. So I guess the point here is that I lucked out in many ways. So I can't offer myself as a model exactly. But it is true that if you get tenure as an academic in our world, you basically have pretty complete freedom to research whatever you want. You have to teach some classes, but that's actually not that demanding, and it's not actually that, painful. And then most academics don't use this freedom, but you can study whatever you want. Not only that, you have sort of credentials and contacts so that people take you more seriously if you do them. And that's a great resource. And so I've used that resource. And so since getting tenure in 2006, I have been doing a wide range of different things. And so I'm very happy. So, I mostly just do things I can do by myself. I don't need funding or students or things like that. But, I can then turn on a dime. So I feel like, for example, once I see cultural drift's a problem 9 months ago, I just go, okay, now I'm going to focus on this, and I'm just going to go with it. And that's just something most academics aren't able or willing to do, to just look around for what seems the most important thing and then switch to that full time when they've got an inkling that something's important, regardless of whether there's any demand for it. So
actually, could you zone into that piece of how you think about, because I've heard you on different podcasts talking about different elements of it as to how you pick what to work on. So in particular, I'm interested in how much you think about, impact or scale in some objective rational sense versus, and then how that intersects with things you find interesting and stimulating, and like where that balance
So
is.
first I should say I follow a life polymath strategy, which is instead of staying in one discipline in one area, I have moved across many different areas over time. And the main payoff of that strategy is noticing connections between different areas where you see tools or issues in one apply to others. And that strategy, its payoff increases with age. The more things you've seen, then the more intersections you could notice. And so even if there's a sort of per day productivity decline as you get older, in terms of just raw energy and intensity and what you can pay attention to, that's countered by this increasing scale of all the things you can see and connect. So I feel like I'm still, below peak even in terms of productivity, even though I'm older and less energetic because of this polymath strategy. So, but that takes a long time to pay off. Early on, you don't, when you've seen 3 areas so far, you only get to connect the third area to the first 2, and the chance of seeing connections kind of small. So the payoff is kind of small at the beginning, right? But it accumulates with time.
Was that strategy just your personal inclination, or
Yes,
was it
yes.
like a rational thing that you thought,
so
this is how I can have the most impact?
If you look at academic wannabes who fail, and you ask, why do they fail? Well, a lot of them just fail from ability, but many fail not from ability, but from strategy. And the most common reason for wannabe academics to fail is not focusing enough. So I was just failing in the usual way, but I squeaked by and, didn't fail, but nevertheless, I was on track to fail for the usual reason. So I can't claim to be unique in that way at all, other than the getting lucky and not failing.
And presumably because you picked economics, which is like broad enough, and you were probably at places.
Right. So initially I was in physics, and they just can't do as many things and call it physics, or computer science. You can do more things and call it computer science, but not as many. But you can do a lot of things and call it econ. And so that was a clever choice there. And then in terms of more specific things, I just think like topics have obvious metrics of importance that I don't get why anybody has any problem with. Clearly the number of people involved, or the size of the economic thing involved, or the fraction of our lives involved, or how much we care about them. I mean, there's just obvious metrics about what matters in the world. And so I don't have any problem applying to each topic those metrics to talk about its fundamental importance. So my 3 components I want in a topic or something is importance first, then neglected. And I think, again, that's pretty easy. You just look at attention relative to importance. It's easy to look at attention, right? The number of books, the number of papers, the number of people, etc. It's easy to measure attention. It's relatively easy to measure importance. So neglected is just that ratio, right? Something that's important but neglected. And there's a lot of those. They're not that hard to find. You just keep looking at topics and just bothering to apply these metrics, you will easily find a great many important neglected topics. One of the justifications, of course, is why they're important neglected is they're just too hard. You can't find an angle. Well, that's where the polymath thing comes in. You look at an important neglected topic and you play around with it and you say, do I have any tools that would let me do something with this? And that's the third requirement. I need to find an angle. Something I could use to make progress on this. If you can't find it, so, look, is there a God? Important. Neglected? Kind of. I mean, hardly anybody studies, is there a God? I don't have an angle on that. I don't know how to make progress on that. So the third part isn't there. But the first 2 are fine. Important, neglected. Is there a God, right? But for many other topics, I do find angles. And I do that because I have a long history of tools, of all the things I've seen, all the tools I've collected. And then, for example, recently, a couple of years ago, I did this stuff on grabby aliens, or aliens in space-time. And that's where I noticed a paper and I said, oh, this is neglected. I knew it was an important question because I'd written on it years before. And I noticed a paper said, oh, this effect has been neglected. People haven't been including this effect. It's a big effect. I said, aha, important, neglected, and I have an angle. we're, going to go with it.
And so this is a strategy that you said has like increasing returns to age. And so
Exactly.
And so if a young person wants to kind of try to do this or emulate this in very, very broad strokes, not do precisely what you ended up doing, what advice do you want to give them in the early
So
stages?
one last piece of advice. So there are many dilettantes in the world, right? And so dilettantes will just read a book on this and read a book on that and, read this and talk about that. And they just bounce around all sorts of little things. And then that's not the point here. So the point is to stick with something enough to make a contribution. So the standard you should have is you should read widely and read different things. But the point is to look for something that you're going to put more effort into and draw that line. Have I decided, this I'm going to put some effort. But then the standard there is, am I going to make a contribution? A novel original contribution, world-class contribution to this topic. If I don't think I can do that, well, it's just another dilettante thing to read. It's fine to have some free time and leisure to read some things and learn some things, and you're searching for interesting connections or interesting neglected things. But a project is going to be, I see something important neglected with kind of an angle, and like I'm going to hold myself to the standard of I'm going to go into that for long enough to make an original contribution, and then I'm allowed to leave and do something else. But if I just go halfway and I don't make a contribution, I'm going to look back and go, that's a failure, Robin. Like you did not do what you're supposed to do there. That was a dilettante thing. That's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to make actual contributions.
So it's like serial monogamy type of.
Exactly. Yes, something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Although you're allowed to do them in parallel, but maybe like intense relationship concept, right? I don't want to have a one-night fling with an idea, topic. Maybe I'll have several lovers at once, but each one of them I'm going to give many months of devotion and attention to.
All right. So Robin is pro poly, but only in the idea space, not necessarily in the human space. We should wrap it up, but this has been so interesting and such a great conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. Robin writes at Overcoming Bias. Buy his books, The Age of Ends and The Elephant in the Brain, and follow him on Twitter. He's very prolific. All right. Thank you so much, and see you all next time.